She was 27, the daughter of a dead blacksmith, and the town of Carbon Creek thought she had lost her mind. With the last of her inheritance, 2 stout mules and a heavy wagon, and every foot of chain her father had ever forged, she was trying to move a dead locomotive. It sat rusted to the rails on a forgotten spur line, a monument to a failed silver mine and the railroad's indifference. They said she had no family, no money, and no sense. Just a stubborn set to her jaw and a fool's attachment to scrap iron. But what nobody in that Wyoming valley knew, what the railroad foreman who mocked her had long forgotten, was that the engine's coal tender was double-walled for the high mountain passes. And a thing like that, as her father once wrote in his ledger, was never truly empty. Settle in and stay close for this one. And in the comments below, let us know where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to hear from you. Ellen Marsh had grown up in the rhythmic world of her father's smithy, a world defined by the hiss of hot steel in the slack tub and the deep percussive breath of the great bellows. Her father, Thomas Marsh, was a man of few words and capable hands, a master of his craft, who saw the world not as a collection of people and problems, but as a series of things that needed mending, strengthening, or making. He had come to Wyoming with the railroad, laying track and repairing engines, but had settled in Carbon Creek to serve the miners, ranchers, and townsfolk, his forge glowing like a steady heart in the center of the small, wind-scoured community. Ellen was his only child, her mother having been taken by a fever when she was just a girl, and she became his shadow, his apprentice, his legacy. While other girls were learning needlepoint, Ellen was learning the different colors of heated iron, the pale straw yellow for tempering a chisel, the cherry red for a workable bend, the brilliant, almost white heat for a perfect forge weld. Her father never treated her skills as a curiosity. To him, it was simply work, and Ellen had a talent for it. He taught her how to read the grain in a piece of steel, how to listen for the flaw in an axle with the tap of a hammer, and how to coax a true, straight line from a warped bar of iron. For her 10th birthday, he had forged her a small cross-peen hammer, its head no bigger than a hen's egg, its hickory handle shaped perfectly for her hand. It was a tool of exquisite balance and utility, a miniature version of his own, and it became the object through which she understood his quiet, profound love. She carried it always in the pocket of her canvas trousers. His death, when it came, was as quiet and unyielding as the man himself. A lung sickness, born of years breathing coal dust and metal filings, had taken him slowly, until one morning he simply did not rise from his bed. He left behind a legacy of good work, a town full of tools he had mended and plows he had sharpened, but also a ledger full of debts. The cost of iron and high-grade coal, the new anvil shipped from Pittsburgh, the credit he extended to ranchers during the hard winter, it all added up. The ejection was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, administrative grinding away of her world. Miss Abernathy, the town banker and head of the council, a man whose carriage horses wore shoes forged by her father, explained the situation with a regret that felt thin and practiced. The smithy and the land it stood on would have to be sold to clear Thomas Marsh's accounts. A buyer had already been found, a businessman from Cheyenne who planned to install a new man, someone with modern ideas. Ellen stood in the cool, dim office, her hands clasped behind her back, and listened. She did not plead or argue. The numbers were what they were, as unchangeable as the tensile strength of cold-rolled steel. The day the papers were signed, she walked back to the smithy, the air already feeling alien in the space that had been her entire life. The smell of coal smoke and quenching oil was fading, replaced by the scent of dust and finality. The new owner had given her 3 days to clear out her personal effects. Everything else, the forge, the anvil, the great cone mandrel, the leg vis bolted to a post her father had set himself, belonged to the bank now. The foreman for the Union Pacific Spur, Frank Pike, a broad-shouldered man with a voice accustomed to shouting over the noise of steam engines, came by on the second day. He looked around the silent shop, his eyes assessing everything for its scrap value. He offered her a flat price for the remaining stock of bar iron, the odds and ends, and the tools not considered part of the building itself. "It's a fair price, Ellen," he said, his tone attempting kindness, but landing on pity. "More than you'd get from the scrapper." He then gestured to the 2 old mules and the heavy freight wagon in the yard. "I'll take the team and wagon too, help you get a fresh start somewhere else." She looked at the mules, Patience and Foley, her father's last living assets. She nodded slowly. "I'll sell you the team and wagon," she said, her voice even, "but not the chains." Pike frowned, looking at the heavy, intricate loops of chain hanging from a rafter, each link perfectly welded, a testament to her father's skill. "What do you need with all that chain?" he asked, a hint of impatience in his voice. "It's just dead weight." She met his gaze. "It's my father's work," she said, and that was all. He shrugged, paid her the agreed-upon sum in cash, and left her with a pocket full of bills, her father's little hammer, and a pile of heavy, dark chain. Her journey was short in distance, but immense in its finality. She loaded the chains onto a small handcart she had built herself years ago, the iron links clanking a mournful rhythm on the wooden bed. Pulling the cart, she walked out of the town of Carbon Creek, leaving the smithy and the life within it behind her. She did not look back. Her path took her east, following the line of the railroad tracks as they wound their way out of the small cluster of buildings and into the open valley. The wind, a constant presence in this part of Wyoming, pushed against her, carrying the scent of pine and the sharp, clean smell of distant snow. The sky was a vast, indifferent blue, dotted with high, thin clouds that promised colder weather to come. It was a landscape that tolerated human endeavor, but never fully embraced it. A place of hard ground and stark beauty. Her destination was a place most people in town had forgotten, a short, dead-end spur line that branched off the main railway about 2 miles out. It had been built a decade ago to service a silver mine high in the Laramie Mountains, but the vein had run dry within a year, and the railroad, having no more use for it, had simply abandoned it. They had pulled up the valuable switches and signals, but had left the last engine that had serviced the line sitting right where it had stopped. It was too remote, and the scrap value too low, to justify the cost of hauling it out. To everyone else, it was an eyesore, a piece of industrial refuse slowly surrendering to the elements. To Ellen, it was something else entirely. As she drew closer, the locomotive grew on the horizon, a black, hulking shape against the pale green of the sagebrush. It was a Baldwin 440, an American-type engine, once the proud workhorse of the frontier. Now its iron hide was blistered with rust, its cab windows shattered, its great driving wheels half buried in the hard-packed soil. The silence around it was profound, broken only by the wind whistling through the holes in its boiler jacket. She stopped the handcart and walked a slow circle around the machine, her calloused fingers tracing the lines of rust and decay. She saw the frozen pistons, the cracked connecting rods, the general state of ruin, but she also saw the integrity of the main frame, the solid construction of the tender, the sheer volume of raw material it represented. She felt the cold, solid reality of it beneath her hands. It was not a ruin, it was a resource. It was a problem of engineering, and that was a language she understood. The acquisition of the derelict locomotive was a simple, almost absurdly bureaucratic act that stood in stark contrast to the physical immensity of the object itself. Ellen walked back to town the next morning, the small roll of bills from Frank Pike tucked securely in her pocket. She went not to the bank or the general store, but to the county land office, a dusty, little-used room at the back of the courthouse. The clerk, a balding man named Mr. Chike Hemlock, looked up over his spectacles as she entered, his expression a mixture of boredom and surprise. Few people had business there. "Help you?" he mumbled, not bothering to rise. "I'd like to file a salvage claim," Ellen said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet room. "On the abandoned locomotive. Engine 73, on the old mountain spur." Hemlock blinked. He put down his pen and stared at her. "The old Baldwin? Child, What in God's name for? That thing is naught but a pile of rust. I have my reasons, Ellen replied simply. What is the fee? The clerk sighed, a long, weary sound, and pulled a massive leather-bound ledger from a shelf. He ran a dusty finger down a page, squinting at the spidery script. Abandoned railroad property on unregistered right-of-way. Falls under territorial salvage law. $10 for the claim filing. Gives you sole right to whatever you can haul off. He looked at her again, a flicker of something. Pity, perhaps, or disbelief in his eyes. It's your money. Ellen counted out $10 from her small hoard, the crisp bills looking flimsy and insignificant on the massive wooden desk. Mr. Hemlock painstakingly filled out a form in triplicate, the scratching of his nib the only sound. He handed her one of the copies. It was a simple piece of paper, but it was a deed. It made the iron monster hers. When she returned to the spur line, she was not alone. Word had traveled fast in a town as small as Carbon Creek. Frank Pike was there, leaning against his wagon, his arms crossed over his chest. A few other men from the railroad yard and a couple of curious ranchers stood at a distance, watching. Heard you bought yourself a train, Ellen. Pike called out, a smirk playing on his lips. Planning on driving it to Cheyenne? Laughter rippled through the small group of onlookers. Ellen ignored them. She unhooked the mules, Patience and Foley, from the wagon she had just sold to Pike, and led them to the front of the locomotive. She began the slow, methodical process of rigging the chains, looping them around the main frame, and connecting them to the mules' heavy work harnesses. It was a task of immense complexity, requiring a deep understanding of leverage and load distribution. Pike watched, his amusement slowly giving way to a grudging respect for her skill. You'll kill those mules, girl, he said, his voice losing some of its mocking edge. That engine weighs 50 tons. You can't move it. I don't have to move it far, she said, not looking at him, just off the rails. The discovery was not a moment of sudden, dramatic revelation, but the culmination of patient, arduous labor. For 3 days, Ellen worked. She did not try to move the entire locomotive at once, as Frank Pike and the others had assumed. She was a blacksmith's daughter. She knew how to break a thing down into its essential parts. Her first goal was simply to shift the massive machine enough to break the bond of rust and earth that held it fast. She used the mules not to pull, but to provide tension on the chains, while she worked with long iron bars as levers, slowly, painstakingly rocking the great wheels. The sound was a groaning, tearing shriek of metal on metal that echoed across the valley. On the third day, with a final, shuddering lurch, the locomotive slid sideways off the rails and settled into the dirt, listing at a heavy angle. The onlookers had long since grown bored and left. Only Frank Pike remained, watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. With the engine off the tracks, Ellen's real work began. She spent another week methodically disassembling what she could. She used her father's tools, wrenches, chisels, and the heavy sledgehammer to remove bolts, sever pipes, and break free the smaller components. But her focus, from the very beginning, was on the tender. It was a large, rectangular car, designed to hold tons of coal and thousands of gallons of water. It sat behind the locomotive, slightly askew. She remembered a conversation with her father years ago, when a similar engine had been in his shop for repairs. He had been tapping on the wall of its tender, listening. Mountain runners, he had told her, they build them different. Double wall. For insulation. Keeps the water from freezing solid on a long winter grade. And then he had added, almost as an afterthought, a phrase that had stuck in her memory. They say you can never truly empty one. She found his old ledger among her few possessions, the one where he sketched designs and jotted notes. On a page filled with drawings of a leaf spring assembly, she found the scribble, Baldwin Mountain Tender, 440. Inner wall, 8-inch void, packed with coal dust for insulation. It was not a letter from a hidden benefactor, but it was a map left by the one person who had always believed in her. The next morning, she went to work on the tender's forward wall. It was a solid plate of 3/4-inch steel. She chose her spot carefully, just above the frame, and began to work with a cold chisel and her father's sledge. It was brutal, punishing labor. The clang of the hammer on the chisel was a sharp, piercing report that rang in her ears. Sweat soaked her shirt, and her arms ached with a fire that went bone deep. After hours of work, she had managed to cut a deep 12-inch line into the steel. With a final, perfectly placed blow, the chisel broke through. There was no cascade of treasure. Instead, a quiet, dry whisper and a small stream of black dust and granules trickled out onto the ground. She worked the opening wider and reached inside. Her hand did not meet an empty void but a densely packed mass. It was coal, not the dusty insulation she had expected, but high-quality lump anthracite coal, perfectly dry and preserved in its steel tomb. The railroad had filled the void for weight and balance on the steep grades, a common but undocumented practice. Tucked deep inside, her probing fingers found something else. A heavy, oilcloth-wrapped crate. She dragged it out into the daylight and pried it open. Inside, nestled in grease-soaked wool, was a treasure trove of spare parts, brand-new brass injectors, a set of bronze bearings, copper tubing, gaskets, valves, and a box of heavy-duty bolts. It was a maintenance kit, forgotten for a decade. It was more than fuel. It was the raw material for survival. The rebuilding began not with a grand design, but with the most fundamental of human needs, warmth. The first snows of winter had already dusted the high peaks, and the wind carried a biting chill that promised a harsh season. Ellen knew she could not survive in a simple tent. She needed a fortress against the cold. Her gaze fell upon the locomotive's massive firebox and boiler. It was too damaged to ever hold steam again, but its thick, riveted plates were a blacksmith's dream. Over the next 2 weeks, she performed a feat of deconstruction and fabrication that would have made her father proud. Using her chisels and sledge, she painstakingly cut away a large, cylindrical section of the boiler. It was slow, brutal work, each cut requiring hundreds of precise, powerful hammer blows. She then dragged the heavy steel cylinder, which was nearly 5 feet in diameter, to the side of the tender. Using the salvaged bolts from the crate and iron bars she forged into brackets, she mounted it horizontally. She cut an opening for a fire door, and, using the salvaged flue pipes from the locomotive's smokebox, she engineered a tall, efficient chimney that rose high above the tender. She had not just built a stove, she had created a furnace. A massive, radiant heart of iron capable of turning her hidden store of anthracite coal into a formidable shield against the coming winter. While she worked on the stove, she began the construction of her shelter. She used the solid, flat side of the coal tender as the back wall of her new home. From the abandoned mine's tailings, she salvaged weathered timbers and planks, and with them, she built a sturdy lean-to structure, banking the walls with earth for insulation. The windows were scavenged from the locomotive's cab, their broken panes painstakingly replaced with greased canvas that let in a dim, watery light. The first true blizzard hit the valley with the fury of a physical assault. The wind howled, and the snow fell so thick and fast that it erased the world beyond a few feet. In town, people huddled in their poorly insulated homes, stuffing rags into the cracks around windows and burning their precious firewood at an alarming rate. The first person to seek out Ellen's strange refuge was not a friend or an ally, but a figure of quiet desperation. The widow Gable, a woman with 2 small children, appeared at her door as a wraith in the swirling snow, her shawl crusted with ice. Her husband had been a miner, killed in a rockfall 2 years prior, and she survived on the town's charity, living in a shack that was little more than a collection of boards. "Our fire's out," she said, her voice trembling, her children shivering beside her. "We have no more wood." Ellen said nothing. She simply stepped aside, holding the heavy plank door open, and let them into the overwhelming, radiant warmth of her shelter. The great boiler stove glowed with a dull red heat, and the air was dry and safe. The community did not form through declarations of friendship or formal agreements, but through a slow, quiet coalescing around the warmth of Ellen's stove. The blizzard did not relent. For 4 days, it buried the valley under a thick blanket of white, snapping telegraph lines and making travel between houses a dangerous undertaking. Word of the widow Gable's sanctuary spread not by voice, but by observation. A neighbor, seeing no smoke from the Gable shack, but light in the strange structure by the tracks, understood. Soon, others followed. The Rodriguez family, whose small adobe home had a crack in the foundation, arrived next, the father carrying a sleeping child wrapped in every blanket they owned. They brought with them a pot of beans and a string of dried chilies, placing it on the flat top of the stove without a word. The offering was a silent contract of shared survival. An old prospector named Silas Blackwood, who lived alone in a dugout by the creek, appeared on the 3rd day. He was a gnarled, wiry man with knowledge of the old ways. He looked at the growing number of people crammed into the lean to and then at the remaining timbers Ellen had salvaged. Need to expand, he stated, not as a suggestion, but as a fact. He spent the rest of the day in the howling wind, rigging a block and tackle from the locomotive's frame, using his knowledge of knots and leverage to help Ellen haul heavy beams into place. By nightfall, they had doubled the size of the shelter. People contributed what they could. One woman brought a side of bacon, another a sack of flour. The men took turns venturing into the storm to check on the town's livestock, their efforts coordinated from the relative comfort of what they were now calling the tender. On the 4th day, a figure emerged from the whiteout, leading a team of draft horses pulling a sled laden with lumber and canvas. It was Frank Pike. He was covered in snow, his face red from the wind. He did not offer an apology or an explanation. He simply looked at the crowded, steamy shelter, at the faces of the children sleeping near the stove, and then at Ellen. "The boiler flue pipes," he said, his voice loud to be heard over the wind. "We can rig them through the west wall. Create a second chimney. You can build another stove from the firebox door. It'll heat the new section." It was his form of concession, an admission offered not in words, but in work. He had brought 2 of his railroad crew, and they set to the task with professional efficiency, their movements precise and economical. Frank worked alongside them, his earlier mockery replaced by a focused, quiet intensity. He was a man who understood the mechanics of things, and he recognized in Ellen's creation a piece of engineering as practical and impressive as any locomotive he had ever run. He was no longer seeing a fool who had wasted her money on scrap. He was seeing a woman who had built a harbor in the middle of a storm. As the blizzard finally broke and a pale, watery sun emerged, the shelter by the tracks had transformed. It was no longer just Ellen's lean-to. It had become the heart of the community's winter survival. The tender, as everyone now called it, was a sprawling, seemingly chaotic, but deeply functional structure of salvaged wood, canvas, and iron, all anchored to the great, rust-colored bulk of the locomotive and its tender. 2 stoves, one made from the boiler and the other from the firebox, burned steadily, their chimneys breathing plumes of clean white smoke into the cold, crisp air. Inside, a new kind of society had taken root. The space was divided by blankets hung from the rafters, creating semi-private alcoves for the 3 families who had lost their homes entirely to the cold. A communal cooking area had formed around the larger stove, where Maria Rodriguez now presided, orchestrating meals from the pooled resources of half the town. Ellen was no longer an outcast. She was the undisputed center of this new world. People did not defer to her with overt displays of leadership, but with a quiet, constant consultation. "Ellen, Silas thinks this beam needs another brace. What iron do you have?" "Ellen, the flue is drawing smoke back. Can you take a look?" She moved through the space with a calm authority, her father's small hammer tucked into her belt, her hands as comfortable mending a child's toy as they were forging a new hinge for the main door. Her name was known now, not as the blacksmith's daughter, a title of pity and dismissal, but as Ellen Marsh, the woman who had seen a shelter where everyone else saw only scrap. Small rituals began to form, lending a sense of permanence to their temporary world. Every morning, Frank Pike would arrive with his crew, not because they were ordered to, but because they had taken on the project of reinforcing and improving the tender as their own. They brought tools, expertise, and a steady supply of salvaged materials from the railroad yard. Every evening, the inhabitants would gather as the light faded, sharing stories and making plans for the next day. The children, safe and warm for the first time in weeks, had claimed the old locomotive cab as their playhouse, their laughter a strange and beautiful sound in the heart of the metal beast. The locomotive itself had been transformed. It was no longer a symbol of failure and abandonment. Its parts had been repurposed into the bones and circulatory system of a home. It was a stove, a wall, a source of raw materials, and an anchor against the relentless Wyoming wind. It was proof that value was not an inherent quality, but a matter of vision and will. It had become a living place, filled with purpose, respected, and strangely beautiful in its functional, resilient form. In the quiet of a late afternoon, weeks after the great blizzard had passed, Ellen stood by the entrance of the tender, watching the winter sun cast long blue shadows across the snow. The air was still and cold, but inside the shelter, life hummed with a steady, quiet warmth. She could hear the low murmur of Mrs. Gable reading a story to the children, the gentle clink of Maria Rodriguez preparing the evening meal, and the rhythmic rasp of a saw as Frank and Silas worked to build a new cold storage locker against the north wall. The massive stove, her first creation from the bones of the locomotive, radiated a deep, comforting heat that could be felt even from where she stood. It was the center of their world, a sun forged from iron and coal. She pulled her father's small hammer from her belt. The hickory handle was smooth and dark from years of use, its contours molded to her grip. She held it in her palm, feeling its perfect, familiar weight. For so long, it had been her only connection to him, a tangible piece of his love in a world that had taken everything else. She looked from the small hammer to the immense, functional shelter she had built around it. She had used his tools, yes, but more importantly, she had used his way of seeing. He had taught her to look at a broken thing not for what it was, but for what it could become. He had seen the potential in a cast-off piece of iron, and he had seen the capable woman in the small girl at his side. The town had mocked her, called her a fool for wasting her last resources on a pile of rust. Frank Pike, a man who understood engines better than anyone, had seen only scrap value. But she had seen the double-walled tender, the promise of the hidden coal, the strength of the boilerplate. She had seen her father's notes in the ledger, and she had trusted them. She had trusted him. Frank walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't look at her, but at the structure. "She'll hold," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a final verdict. "Yes," Ellen said, "she will." Ellen Marsh was 27, and she was home. She had been left with nothing but 2 mules, a wagon, and a pile of old chains. She had spent the last of her money on a salvage claim for a rusted locomotive nobody wanted. It was the best $10 she had ever spent. We are all builders, in our own way, finding value in the places and people that others have overlooked. In the quiet strength of our own hands, we find the power not only to survive, but to create a space for others to be safe as well. Thank you for joining us for this story. Let us know in the comments below. What is something you have built or mended that holds a special meaning for you? We read every one. Until next time, stay warm and take care of one another. What would you do if all you had left was a choice to honor the dead? What if your last dollar could buy not a future, but a past? This is the story of Esther Whitcomb, a widow in 1880s Wyoming, who spent her entire savings on a forgotten graveyard the town wanted to erase. They called her mad, a fool chasing ghosts. But the truth waiting inside the oldest plot would not just rewrite her own story. but unearth the buried sins on which the entire town was built. Settle in, and let us know where you're watching from, as we journey to a place where memory itself becomes a reckoning. Esther Whitcomb arrived in Redemption Gulch with the dust of the trail settled into the seams of her black mourning dress. She was 29, but grief had carved years into the quiet planes of her face. She stepped down from the stagecoach, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were carrying something fragile that might break if she hurried. It was the memory of her husband, Thomas, taken by a fever so swift it had stolen the breath from his lungs before she'd had time to fully understand he was leaving. His last words had not been of love, but of duty. "Don't let them be forgotten, Esther," he'd whispered, his hand cool in hers. "A life unremembered is a life unlived." He had been talking about his parents, buried in a small churchyard back east, but for Esther, the words had become a creed, a final instruction from the man who had been her entire world. She had sold their small homestead in the Dakotas, a place that held too many echoes of his laughter, and was left with a small purse of coins and a single, aging mare named Patience. It was not enough to build a new life, but perhaps it was enough to honor an old one. Redemption Gulch was not a destination she had chosen, but where the stage line ended and her money ran low. The town was a raw gash of timber, and ambition clawed into the side of a wide, windy valley. Its talk was all of progress, of a new railway spur, of growth. And the loudest talk was of expansion. The town council, led by a man whose name seemed to be on every building of consequence, Silas Blackwood, had its eyes on a piece of land just north of town, the old pioneer cemetery. It was an obstacle, a patch of fallow ground holding back the tide of commerce. They wanted it cleared for a new stockyard, a place for the living to profit, built directly atop the place of the dead. Esther heard the whispers in the general store, the dismissive talk in the saloon as she passed. Worthless, an eyesore. Forgotten, and with each utterance of that word, Thomas's last plea echoed in her soul. She spent her first few days in a small room at the boarding house, the scent of boiled cabbage and lye soap a constant presence. She listened more than she spoke, gathering the shape of the town's intention. The graveyard was a nuisance. It held the first generation of settlers, those who had perished in the hard first winters or in the skirmishes that the town's official history glossed over. Their descendants were gone or dead themselves. There was no one left to speak for them. No one, she thought, but a widow with nothing left to lose. She felt a strange pull toward that neglected hill, a kinship with the forgotten souls who rested there. They were, like her, a part of a past that the present was in a great hurry to pave over. The decision to act settled in her not as a choice, but as a quiet, unshakable certainty. It was the only thing that had felt certain since Thomas's final breath. The day of the town council meeting arrived, carried on a dry wind that promised a long, hot summer. The meeting was held in the saloon, the only building large enough, and the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and sawdust. Esther took a seat in the back, a small, still figure in black, almost invisible in the shadows. Silas Blackwood stood at the front, a man made large by his own confidence. He was handsome in a severe way, with a voice that filled the room without effort. He spoke of the future, of cattle and commerce, his words painting a picture of prosperity that left no room for sentiment. "This patch of land," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the hills, "is a relic, a monument to failure. We are a town of the future, and the future requires space." He proposed the sale of the plot, a single acre, for the nominal fee of $20, just enough, he noted with a smirk, to make the transaction legal. A low chuckle moved through the room. $20 for an acre of bones and weeds. It was a joke. The motion was seconded. The vote was called. Hands went up, a forest of casual assent, and then, from the back of the room, a voice, clear and low. "I will buy it." Every head turned. Esther Whitcomb stood, her hands clasped in front of her. The room fell into a profound silence, the kind that follows a dropped plate in a quiet church. Blackwood stared, his expression shifting from command to disbelief, then to amusement. "You, madam?" he asked, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "And what would you do with a graveyard?" Esther met his gaze. "I would care for it," she said simply. The silence broke, replaced by a wave of snickers and confused murmurs. Blackwood, seeing the absurdity of it, laughed outright. "Very well," he boomed. "The town of Redemption Gulch hereby accepts the generous offer of Mrs. Whitcomb, $20. Esther walked to the front, her back straight. She untied the drawstring of her purse and counted out the coins onto the rough-hewn bar. They were nearly all she had. The clerk hastily drew up a deed of sale, his pen scratching in the sudden quiet. As Silas Blackwood countersigned it with a flourish, he leaned toward her and whispered, "Congratulations, Mrs. Whitcomb. You are now the proud owner of nothing. Why would a woman spend her last dollar on a field of forgotten stones? What secret was she chasing? Or what grief was she simply trying to bury alongside strangers?" Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden history. But as the ink dried on that deed, a new chapter for Redemption Gulch was just beginning. The ink on the deed was barely dry before the town's judgment solidified. Esther Whitcomb was not just a grieving widow, she was a madwoman. The purchase became the primary source of gossip and cruel amusement in Redemption Gulch. When she walked down the plank sidewalk to the general store, conversations would halt, replaced by whispers that followed her like a cloud of flies. Mothers would pull their children closer, as if her particular brand of sorrow were contagious. The children, less subtle, would point and chant in low, sing-song voices, "Graveyard Esther bought the bones." She learned to walk with her eyes fixed on the horizon, her face a placid mask that betrayed none of the hurt that pricked at her heart. She was more alone now than she had been in the first raw days of her widowhood. One afternoon, Silas Blackwood made a point of stopping her directly in front of the hotel, where he and his associates were often found. He tipped his hat with exaggerated politeness, his eyes glinting with malice. "Good day, Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "Enjoying your collection of ghosts?" His friends chuckled. Esther simply looked at him, her gray eyes holding his for a moment. She offered no reply, no defense. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. He scoffed, turning back to his companions. "She's addled by grief," he declared, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Esther continued on her way, the sound of their laughter following her down the street. Each jeer, each pointed finger, did not weaken her resolve, but tempered it, hardening it from a soft sentiment into something sharp and resilient, like steel forged in fire. There was one encounter, however, that was different. As she was purchasing a few simple supplies, a scythe, a pair of thick leather gloves, a whetstone, an old woman entered the store. She was Shoshone, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her hair in 2 long silver braids. The townsfolk called her Stands in Silence, for she rarely spoke and moved with a quiet dignity that seemed to belong to the mountains themselves. She watched Esther for a long moment with dark, knowing eyes. As Esther paid for her goods and turned to leave, the old woman stepped into her path and gently placed a hand on her arm. The touch was surprisingly firm, the skin of her hand as soft and dry as old leather. She leaned in close, her voice a low murmur, like wind through pine needles. "The oldest roots," she said, her gaze intense, "hold the deepest water." Then, just as quickly, she released Esther's arm and was gone, melting back into the sun-drenched street. The words were cryptic, a puzzle Esther could not solve. She stood there for a moment, the weight of the old woman's hand still palpable on her sleeve, the strange sentence echoing in her mind. It felt less like a warning and more like a blessing, though she could not say why. That evening, packing her few belongings into saddlebags, she felt a profound sense of isolation. The town had cast her out. She was an eccentric, a pariah. But as she saddled her old mare Patience, the horse nudged her shoulder with its soft nose and let out a low, rumbling sigh. Looking into the animal's large, gentle eye, Esther felt a surge of defiance. They could all laugh. They could all whisper. They did not understand. She wasn't buying death. She was buying memory. She was fulfilling a promise to the only person who had ever truly known her. The cryptic words of the Shoshone woman returned to her. Oldest roots, deepest water. Perhaps she was digging for something after all. The next day, just before dawn, she rode out of Redemption Gulch without a backward glance. She left the whispers and the laughter behind, heading for the low hill that was now, impossibly hers. The air was cool and clean, and as the sun began to crest the eastern peaks, it bathed the valley in a soft, forgiving light. She was not running away. She was going home. The journey to the graveyard was a short climb, but it felt like crossing a boundary into another world. As Esther and Patience crested the final rise, the town of Redemption Gulch fell away behind them, its sounds and concerns muted by the distance and the steady sigh of the wind. Before her lay her acre. The late afternoon sun slanted across the hill, casting long, somber shadows from the few pine trees that clung to the rocky soil. The light was the color of old honey, and it gilded the tops of the tall, wild grasses, making the place look both beautiful and profoundly sad. It was worse than she had imagined from afar. The picket fence that had once enclosed the grounds had mostly collapsed, its weathered boards splintering back into the earth. Weeds and thorny bushes grew in a tangled riot, choking the faint outlines of what might have once been paths. Most of the headstones were tilted at weary angles, as if tired of standing watch. Many had fallen completely, their faces pressed into the dirt, their inscriptions obscured. The place didn't feel haunted by ghosts so much as by neglect. It smelled of dust, of dry grass, of the sweet, slow decay of pine needles. It was the scent of forgetting. Esther dismounted, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, untrodden ground. She let Patience's reins drop. The old mare immediately lowered her head and began to graze on a patch of less bitter weeds, her presence a calm, steady anchor in the profound stillness. Esther walked the perimeter slowly, her hand trailing along the top of a broken fence post. The wood was smooth and silvered with age, soft to the touch. This was hers. This mess, this responsibility. She felt a pang of doubt, a cold knot in her stomach. Blackwood's mocking voice echoed in her head. You are now the proud owner of nothing. Had she been a fool? Had she traded the last of her security for a field of sorrow? She thought of Thomas, of his fever-bright eyes, and his final, urgent request. No, this was not nothing. This was a duty. She walked deeper into the cemetery, her skirts whispering against the dry stalks of yarrow and sage. She found a small, sheltered clearing near a cluster of young aspen trees whose leaves trembled and shimmered in the breeze, making a sound like gentle rain. The ground here was relatively flat and clear. This would be her camp. She wasn't ready to face the town again, to sleep under a roof where she was an object of ridicule. Here, at least, the silence was honest. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in strokes of violet and bruised orange, she built a small fire. The flames pushed back the gathering dark, creating a small circle of warmth and light. She ate a simple meal of hardtack and dried apples, sharing a piece with Patience, who had wandered closer to the fire's glow. The horse stood nearby, occasionally stamping a hoof or sighing a great, gusty breath into the cooling air. Later, Esther unrolled her bedroll near the fire, but not too near the graves. She lay on her back, looking up at the sky. The stars here were brilliant, flung across the blackness, with a wild, careless beauty she had never seen in more settled places. There was no sound but the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind in the aspens, and the steady, rhythmic chewing of her horse. She was alone, But for the first time in a long time, she did not feel entirely lonely. She had a purpose. She closed her eyes and listened to the deep silence of the hill, as if the land itself had a story to tell, if only someone was finally willing to listen. In the days that followed, Esther fell into a rhythm of labor that was both punishing and purifying. Each morning, she rose with the sun, her body aching from the previous day's work. She would start a small fire, make coffee, and watch the light spill over the valley. Then, with the scythe she had purchased, she began the monumental task of clearing the land. The work was slow and methodical. The swing of the blade, the rasping cut through thick stalks, the gathering of the cut weeds into piles, it became a form of prayer. With every patch of ground she cleared, it felt as if she were clearing a space in her own grief-choked heart. Patience would follow her as she worked, cropping the newly exposed grasses or simply standing watch, a silent, steadfast companion. She started in the newer section of the graveyard, where the stones were mostly marble and the names were still legible. Miller, Jacobson, Smith. She would pause in her work to read them, murmuring the names aloud, giving them voice in the quiet air. She felt she was getting to know the inhabitants of her small, silent town. As she worked her way toward the older, more neglected section, the markers changed. They became rougher, cruder, slabs of local fieldstone, their inscriptions weathered nearly to nothing by a century of wind and snow. This was the heart of the forgetting, the place where memory had worn thinnest. It was during one evening, as the light began to fail, that she noticed it. The sun was setting, and its low, angular light threw every dip and rise in the ground into sharp relief. She was working near what appeared to be the oldest part of the cemetery, a corner where the stones were almost completely consumed by the earth. One plot stood out. The marker wasn't a carved headstone at all, but a single, massive slab of dark, iron-rich fieldstone, roughly rectangular, sunk deep into the ground. It was stark and artless. While the stones around it bore the faint traces of names and dates, this one was marked only with a single, deeply carved symbol, a simple spiral, turning in on itself. It looked less like a memorial and more like a sign. What truly caught her attention, however, was the ground itself. The earth over a grave, even a very old one, settles in a particular way, creating a gentle, oblong depression. Here, the ground was different. It was unnaturally flat, almost compacted, as if it had been disturbed and then deliberately tamped down. It didn't have the soft, sunken look of a true burial plot, a small, strange detail that refused to fit. She ran her gloved hand over the cold stone, tracing the deep groove of the spiral. It felt ancient, purposeful. Just then, Patience, who had been grazing nearby, lifted her head. The mare took a few steps toward the spiral stone, then stopped. She snorted, her ears swiveling nervously, and backed away, refusing to go any closer. She shook her head and moved to a different part of the hill, pointedly turning her back on the spot. Esther watched her, a prickle of unease running down her spine. Animals knew things. They felt things people missed. The horse's quiet refusal was a louder warning than any human voice. Esther didn't understand what it meant, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this place was different. It held a secret, and the land itself was trying to keep it. The scale of the work was beyond her. The fallen stones were too heavy, the collapsed fence too extensive for one woman's strength. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. If she was to honor this place, she needed help. There was only one person in Redemption Gulch she could imagine asking, a man who worked with wood and stone and sorrow, and who seemed to exist just outside the town's petty cruelties. His name was Isaac Hale. He was the town's carpenter, and when necessity called, its coffin maker. A widower himself for some years, he lived in a small workshop at the edge of town, a place that smelled of pine shavings and quiet industry. He was a man of few words, known for the quality of his work and the fairness of his prices. He had lost his wife to childbirth, and the tragedy had left him with a reserved gentleness that the other men in town mistook for weakness. Esther had seen him once, helping a child retrieve a lost ball from a rooftop, his movements patient and kind. She found him in his workshop, planing a long plank of pine. An old, three-legged dog with a grizzled muzzle lay sleeping in a patch of sunlight by the door. The dog, whom she later learned was named Shadow, lifted its head and gave a single, soft thump of its tail as she entered. Isaac looked up, his hands still on the plane. He was not a large man, but his arms and shoulders showed the dense muscle of his trade. His face was weathered, kind. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, his voice a low baritone. He did not seem surprised to see her. Esther explained her purpose directly, without preamble. "I need help in the cemetery," she said. "The stones are too heavy for me to lift alone. I can pay. Not much, but I can pay." She expected him to refuse, or at least to show some sign of the town's derision. Instead, he simply listened, his blue eyes watching her face intently. He set his plane down carefully on the workbench and wiped his hands on a cloth. "I heard what you did," he said, his voice neutral. "Folks are talking." "I know," Esther replied, her chin lifting slightly. Isaac was silent for a long moment, stroking the smooth surface of the wood he'd been working. Shadow got to his feet, hobbled over, and leaned his head against Isaac's leg. Finally, Isaac looked at her. "I'll help you," he said. "The pay can wait. It's good work. Right work." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over Esther. She had not realized how much she had braced herself for another rejection. The next morning, Isaac arrived at the graveyard hill in his work wagon, which was loaded with ropes, stout timbers for levers, rollers, and a heavy iron pry bar. Shadow sat proudly on the seat beside him. Thus began their partnership. They worked in a comfortable, practiced silence. Isaac was a natural teacher, showing her how to gain purchase, how to use leverage to make a 1,000-pound stone move, how to mix lime mortar to reset a foundation. He never made her feel weak or foolish. He simply showed her the work, and she learned. Her hands, already calloused, grew tougher. Her muscles, already sore, grew stronger. They spoke little, but a current of understanding flowed between them, a shared language of labor and respect. Together, they slowly began to raise the fallen, to mend the broken, to bring order back to the chaos of neglect. They worked their way across the hill, from the newer graves to the old, until only one task remained. They stood before the strange sunken slab with the spiral carved into its face. "This is the one," Esther said, her voice quiet. Isaac knelt, running his hand over the strange, compacted earth around it, just as she had. He pressed his palm flat against the stone. It was cold, even in the afternoon sun. "You're right," he murmured, looking up at her. "This ground feels wrong. It was never a grave." He stood and studied the massive stone, his carpenter's eye assessing its weight and balance. "It's not a marker," he said after a moment. "It's a lid." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. A lid. Hiding what? Together, they set to work, their movements precise and coordinated. It was the hardest job yet. The stone was immense, settled deep into the earth by time and its own great weight. They dug around the edges, clearing away decades of soil. Using timbers as levers and smaller stones as fulcrums, they strained together, their breath coming in ragged bursts. The muscles in Isaac's arms corded. Esther put her entire weight against the wooden beam, her knuckles white. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groaning sound of stone scraping against stone, the slab shifted. It didn't lift, it pivoted. With one final, coordinated heave, the great stone tilted upwards, held in place by their lever. It revealed not a dark shaft of earth, but a shallow, rectangular cavity, neatly lined with smaller fitted stones. It was a chamber, not a grave. And there, at the bottom, resting on a bed of dry sand, was a heavy, iron-bound strongbox. It was dark with rust, but otherwise intact, its heavy lock still sealed. The last of the day's light fell into the opening, glinting off the dark metal. Esther and Isaac stared down into the hole, then looked at each other. The quiet understanding that had grown between them over days of shared labor now sharpened into a shared, breathless question. Without a word, Isaac lowered himself carefully into the stone-lined space. The air that rose from it was cool and dry, smelling of earth and iron and time. He grasped one of the heavy handles on the side of the box. "It's heavy," he grunted. "Help me." Esther lay on the ground, reaching down. Together they struggled, pulling and lifting, their fingers straining, until they managed to haul the box up and out onto the grass. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. They knelt beside it, their faces illuminated by the single lantern Isaac had lit against the gathering dusk. Using the end of his pry bar, Isaac worked at the rusted lock. The metal shrieked in protest, then broke with a loud snap. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped in surprisingly well-preserved oilcloth, were not jewels or gold, but paper. Several thick, leather-bound ledgers, a neat stack of deeds, tied with twine, and a small bundle of letters, the ink faded, but still legible. Esther reached in with a trembling hand and lifted the top ledger. She opened it. In the flickering, golden light of the lantern, she began to read aloud. The first page was a list of names: Sergeant Elias Thorne, Private Samuel Bell, Corporal James Finch. Beside each name was a record of Army pay allotments and, more importantly, land claims granted by the territorial government for service. These were the names of soldiers, men from the original fort, who were officially listed in the town's history as having been killed in an Arapaho raid 20 years prior. But the dates in the ledger continued for months after the supposed raid. Esther's voice faltered. She picked up one of the deeds. It was for a prime parcel of land, the very land where the Blackwood Ranch now stood. The original claimant was Sergeant Elias Thorne, but the signature transferring the deed was a crude forgery, and the witness was a name they both knew: Jedediah Blackwood, Silas's father. They looked at each other, the terrible truth dawning on them. These men hadn't just been forgotten. They had been erased. As if summoned by the enormity of their discovery, the weather turned. The wind, which had been a steady whisper all day, began to howl, carrying the metallic scent of rain. Dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled over the mountains, swallowing the last of the twilight. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the valley, a distant threat growing closer. "A storm's coming," Isaac said, his voice grim as he looked at the sky. "A bad one." They hastily covered the open cavity with a spare canvas tarp, securing the strongbox and its contents inside the small, dilapidated tool shed that stood at the edge of the property, a shed Isaac had begun to repair. They were barely inside when the sky opened up. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid wind-driven sheets. Lightning split the sky, followed instantly by cracks of thunder so loud the very ground seemed to shake. The storm was a physical manifestation of the chaos they had just unearthed, a wild fury mirroring the violent injustice hidden in the ledgers. The old shed, its roof only partially mended, offered meager shelter. Water found its way through the gaps, dripping onto the dirt floor and turning it to mud. Isaac and Esther huddled together in the driest corner, the lantern casting huge, dancing shadows on the rough planked walls. The strongbox sat between them, a silent, iron witness. The storm raged for what felt like hours, a relentless assault. Sometime near midnight, over the roar of the wind and rain, they heard a new sound, a splintering crash, followed by a human cry of pain and fear. It came from the road at the bottom of the hill. "Someone's in trouble," Isaac yelled over the din. Without hesitation, they grabbed the lantern and plunged out into the maelstrom. The rain was blinding, the wind a physical force that threatened to knock them from their feet. Guided by the faint flickering light of their lantern, they scrambled down the muddy, treacherous slope. At the bottom, they found an overturned wagon, one of its wheels shattered. A man was struggling to free his leg from beneath the wreckage, his face pale with pain. A woman, his wife, was on her knees in the mud beside him, her face a mask of terror. She was heavily pregnant. A small child, no more than 4 years old, was crying, soaked and shivering, clinging to her mother's skirts. Working together, their earlier teamwork now a desperate necessity, Isaac and Esther managed to lever the wagon up just enough for the man to pull his leg free. It was bruised but not broken. Isaac, strong and steady, helped the man to his feet, while Esther gathered the sobbing child into her arms, wrapping him in her own shawl. She then turned to the woman, whose breathing was coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The baby, the woman whispered, her hand clutching her belly. I think it's coming. The shock and the fall had sent her into early labor. There was no question of getting them to town in this storm. There was only one place to go. They half-carried, half-guided the terrified family back up the slippery hill to the relative safety of the tool shed. Inside the cramped space, Esther made a bed of empty grain sacks for the woman. Using the limited knowledge of herbs her mother had taught her, she brewed a calming tea from a small stash of chamomile she kept with her supplies. She spoke to the young mother in a low, soothing voice, her own fear pushed aside by the urgent need of another. All through the long night, as the storm raged outside, Esther and Isaac became guardians. They created a tiny sanctuary of warmth and life in the heart of a storm, on a hill dedicated to the dead. The act of caring for this family, of offering shelter and comfort to strangers in their moment of greatest need, solidified everything. Esther looked from the frightened face of the young mother to the iron box holding its dark secrets. This was not just about the past anymore. It was about the present. It was about choosing to protect the vulnerable, to fight for what was right. It was a choice for life, for justice, for a future built on something better than buried lies. The storm broke just before dawn. The rain ceased, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. A pale, fragile light spread across the valley, and the air was cool and smelled of wet earth and sage. The family was safe. The young mother's labor had slowed, the immediate crisis averted. The father, his name Jacob, looked at Esther and Isaac with eyes full of a gratitude so profound it needed no words. His wife Sarah slept fitfully, the small boy curled up beside her. As the sun rose higher, Jacob took his uninjured horse and rode carefully into town to fetch the doctor and arrange for help with his wagon. He did not just bring back a doctor. He brought back a story of two people on a storm-swept hill who had opened their meager shelter and given everything they had to help strangers. The tale spread through Redemption Gulch faster than any gossip had before. It was a different kind of story than the one the town had been telling about the mad widow. This one spoke of kindness, of courage. At the same time, the other story, the one contained in the iron box, was beginning to stir. Esther knew she could not keep it to herself. With Isaac by her side, she carried the heavy ledgers and deeds into town. They didn't go to Silas Blackwood. They went to the county clerk's office. The clerk, Mr. Abernathy, was a small, meticulous man with spectacles and an abiding respect for the written record. He was known to be scrupulously honest, a man who could not be bought or intimidated. He listened to Esther's quiet explanation without interruption, his expression unreadable. He took the ledgers and the deeds, handling them with a reverence usually reserved for holy texts. "Leave these with me, Mrs. Whitcomb," he said. "I will need to compare them with the official county records." For 2 days, a tense quiet fell over the town. People watched Esther now with a different kind of curiosity, a mixture of awe and apprehension. They saw the clean paths she had cut in the graveyard, the stones she and Isaac had righted. They had heard of the family she had sheltered. The laughter had stopped completely. On the 3rd day, Mr. Abernathy sent for her. She and Isaac went to his office together. The clerk sat behind his desk, the old ledgers open beside his official county books. He looked up at them, his face grim. "They're authentic," he said, his voice low. The signatures, the pay records, the land grants. They match military archives from Fort Laramie. The transfer deeds in our books, they're forgeries. Crude ones, at that. He looked directly at Esther, a new respect in his eyes. These documents tell a very different story of how Redemption Gulch was founded, Mrs. Whitcomb, a story of theft and, I suspect, murder. The truth was now official, recorded, undeniable. Silas Blackwood confronted them as they left the clerk's office. His usual bluster was gone, replaced by a cold, contained fury. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his eyes burning with hate. "You're trying to ruin this town. You're trying to ruin me." Isaac stepped slightly in front of Esther, a silent, protective gesture. "The truth was already there, Blackwood," Isaac said, his voice even. "We just dug it up." Blackwood looked from Isaac's steady gaze to Esther's unflinching one and saw he had no power here. The weight of his father's sins, buried for 2 decades, had finally surfaced. He turned and walked away, a man suddenly diminished, his shadow shorter than it had been before. The townspeople who witnessed the exchange did not gloat. Instead, a quiet, somber understanding began to settle. People started walking up the hill to the cemetery, not to mock, but to see. They walked the clean paths. They read the names on the upright stones, some finding the markers of their own forgotten kin. The graveyard was no longer an eyesore. It had become the town's conscience. The chorus of whispers had shifted from ridicule to reverence. Months passed. The heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The graveyard on the hill was transformed. The broken fence was mended, its new posts smelling of fresh-cut pine. Flowers, transplanted by some of the town's women, now grew in neat beds alongside the stones. The paths were clear and covered in fine gravel. It was no longer a place of forgetting, but a park of memory, a quiet, dignified place where people came to walk and reflect. The town of Redemption Gulch had begun the slow, painful process of reckoning with its own history. The stolen lands were not all returned. The law was too tangled for that. But compensations were made, trusts established for the descendants of the wronged soldiers that Mr. Abernathy managed to locate. Silas Blackwood, humbled and stripped of his unearned moral authority, sold off much of his father's holdings and became a quieter, more watchful man. The town's foundation, once thought to be solid rock, had been revealed as sand, and now they were slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding it on truth. One evening, at the hour when the sun touches the horizon and bathes the world in amber, Esther and Isaac stood on the hill, looking down at the town. The leaves of the aspen trees that sheltered her first campsite were a shimmering, brilliant gold. Isaac had carved a new marker for the empty, stone-lined cavity where the box had been found. It was made of smooth, polished oak, and the inscription was simple. It read, "To the forgotten. Now remembered." The air was still and cool. Isaac reached out and took Esther's hand. His palm was calloused and warm, a perfect fit for hers. She did not pull away. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the first lamps begin to glow in the windows below. Esther looked at the neat rows of stones, each one a life, a story that would no longer be lost. She thought of her journey here, of the grief that had propelled her, of the purpose she had found in this lonely, beautiful place. She looked at Isaac, at the quiet strength in his face, and felt a sense of peace that she thought had been buried forever with Thomas. This was not a replacement, but a continuation, a new chapter. "You know," she said, her voice soft in the twilight, "we weren't just saving a graveyard." Isaac looked at her, his blue eyes gentle. "No," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the peaceful hill and the town beyond. "We were building a foundation. Thank you for joining us on this journey. It's a story that reminds us that true foundations are built on truth, not just on stone." If you were moved by Esther and Isaac's story, please leave a like and a comment, and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten pages of history. We'll see you next time.